All right, we won't just jump right in. I tried to write something we'll read from a paper so it doesn't waste anyone's time. Here we go. I want to try to keep this talk primarily to painting, and I was trying to think of a way that I could talk about my work, but also the work of some others that I hope might be relevant to all of you. And so I want to hone this in on two concepts that I think provide some interesting avenues within painting. Details and corpsing, which are terms that I'll get to, but also they will allow me to talk about my positions on romanticism and irony, but also getting into Deleuze's concept of the pre-pictorial and the limits of naturalism. But before we begin on that, I'd like to discuss what painting is, and I want to do that through parameters that are provided by Deleuze and Hélène Cixous. Deleuze described painting through Cézanne and clay, and specifically for him, painting is defined as this trajectory through its chaos. And maybe it's never through, because painting is really about sustaining that moment throughout. Deleuze, in describing clay, after introducing Cézanne's writing that painting always develops out of chaos, and chaos within oil painting, according to both Cézanne and clay, is related to the color gray. Deleuze says, I'd say the first moment of painting, it's the gray chaos point. It's the absolute. Obviously, this is prior to painting. One can't paint the gray chaos point. When does the act of painting begin? It's on both sides at once. The act of painting, if I dare say, has one hand in the pre-pictorial condition and the other hand within itself. The act of painting is the act that seizes the gray point in order to affix it. In order to place it into the center of the dimensions, it is the act that causes the gray point to leap over itself. And when Deleuze talks about this gray point in deciphering Cézanne and clay, they really mean gray, both as a philosophy and a practical material matter. You all know that chromatic gray can be mixed on the palette, but it's also what naturally happens when you're dragging a brush wet into wet through paint in an undecided way. And you can do it so frequently and often that it becomes a mess. For Deleuze, this is what continues the pre-pictorial condition, when painting is still material and isn't yet attempting to be an image. But for Cézanne and clay, for Deleuze and Cixous, this moment of in-between is where painting really begins. Cixous in her essay, right, on Rembrandt talks about something that might also be a way of talking about this pre-pictorial condition, of how painting is really at its core anti-representational. For Cixous, it is more powerful and convincing by what it doesn't depict than what it does. Painting is always interiority. Cixous' essay on Rembrandt is really finding the edge and limits of naturalism, noting that painting is really insufficient as a naturalist gesture precisely because of all that it can't contain, but also because of all of its excess, all of the gestures that have nothing to do with the concept of what the painting is, but nevertheless remain. Yes, in the painting of Bathsheba, she is holding the crucial letter. The letter is an important detail that drives the narrative and contextualizes the woman as a subject of a recognizable story, but the detail also takes us out of what the painting is actually doing. And this gets ahead a bit because this is really what painting and details always do. According to Cixous, Rembrandt's Bathsheba painting is actually about this non-landscape behind her, this void that Bathsheba stands within. To Cixous, it is like Van Gogh trying to paint the inside of a dying star. Again, painting itself is an act of interiority, not an act of depiction. It is the feeling of the thing, the presence of a feeling, the void that is depicted rather than a document of it. The more it tries to render the world, the more it denies the expression of the world actually feels like. Painting fossilizes images and experiences, whereas the chaotic gray point, the not knowing, sustains it. Some other forms of this pre-pictorial and anti-representational mode before we continue. Pisanello's vision of St. Eustace, which I think does a similar but opposite thing, using the contrivance of a vision, which many artists did to explore abstract scenarios. Pisanello creates a beautiful, dark, and strange landscape filled with animals at the footsteps of the crucifixion. It is a non-space, not quite a void, but it is an absolute and a nothing, and the interior of an idea of what the ancients referred to as il tempore, a time in that time, meaning a sacred time before time began to be recorded, a time before history when we spoke with animals. In Pisanello, the entire world of living things is witness to the suffering and the miracle. The other painting, which is really a machine of painting that maybe arrives at this anti-representational or pre-pictorial mode, is Fra Angelico's Madonna of the Shadows, which if nothing else exists to repudiate our known history of abstract painting in the Western world. Below his painting of the Madonna are 4 panels. They were typically described as attempts of faux painting to depict marble. But Fra Angelico even dripped paint onto the surface to make it look the way it does, and that's significant. George D. Huberman describes it as a direct action, a form of process painting that is made to make us think of the space of the tomb of Christ, a relay of an experience through direct material. But I also believe the pre-pictorial, the anti-naturalist painting can come at the deficit of narrative. Orazio Gentilescu's Holy Family during the flight into Egypt doesn't depict the narrative itself. It doesn't depict the nativity scene or the trip home through the desert. Instead, Orazio makes us think about the beauty that is in the boredom of the time outside of that, the ability to feel comfortable and unthreatened after the adventure. It is a painting of a non-event that frames the event itself, but is also such a reversal of what is often considered to be the subject of a painting. It is another form of Bathsheba's void. But back to Deleuze. Now that we have this, I know, I'm sorry, I want to give you all time. Now that we have this semi-alignment and agreement on this pre-pictorial sensibility, Deleuze goes further, revealing what this pre-pictorial condition is wrestling with. The pre-pictorial is maintaining chaos, maintaining the space of a painting not turning into a picture, but it is also literally the part of the painting that is equal to its making, which is the time before it. Deleuze says, Bacon says that prior to beginning a painting, there are many things that have occurred, and this is precisely why painting implies a kind of catastrophe weighing on the canvas. Why? In order to jettison everything that has preceded it, everything that weighs on the painting before the painting has begun to emerge. What is the name we give to such things that he has to get rid of? What is this struggle with ghosts that precedes painting? Painters have often provided an almost technical term in their own vocabulary, cliches. We might say that cliches already reside in the canvas before painters have even begun to paint, that the worst of cliches is already there, that all the abominations of what is bad in painting already reside there within the potential work. Cézanne knew about cliches, about the struggle against the cliché, before even starting to paint, as if cliches were there like animals rushing in. Already there on the painting before the painter had even picked up his brush. Here we understand why painting is necessarily a flood. One has to drown all that, block all that, kill all that, prevent all these dangers that already weigh down on the canvas by virtue of its pre-pictorial condition. Even if they're not visible, they exist there. Where do such ectoplasms reside? I love the word ectoplasms in that context. In one's head and in one's heart, they're everywhere, in the room, hovering around. It's amazing how these cliches are like ghosts. If you don't commit your painting to endure a catastrophic dynamic like that found in a furnace or a storm, you will only produce cliches. People will say, oh, what a lovely brushstroke, really from a decorator. Yes, it's well done, quite lovely, or else a fashion drawing. Fashion designers know how to sketch quite well, and it's shit at the same time. With no interest, none, zero. There it is. It's the cliche that we are all fighting against. And one of these biggest cliches for me is romanticism. Within this ideology hides the concept of the individual, who is exercising their inherently unique and subjective viewpoint to painting. Within elegant bravura and flourish, within style even, is a coded mystification. As long as we are distracted by a mirage that we can somehow supersede the traumas of society through our unique invention, we become blind to the ways that we are exploited. Jan Verwoerd, channeling the Frankfurt School, goes so far as to say that Romanticism was an invention of the bourgeoisie to distract us from being angry. Because Romanticism promises that when through our own individual spirit, we can maybe avoid being exploited or avoid the traumas of everyday life, and we no longer need to rely on class consciousness. The petty bourgeois is always incapable of seeing class consciousness, and the romantic drive, this cliche of painting, assumes that the artist is a petty bourgeois position within culture rather than an adversarial one, which is insufficient. So how do we get outside of cliche? How do we get outside of this concept of free individualism that makes the role of the painter no different than the role of the platform influencer? I want to switch back to Sisu now, and I want to talk about where she can engage with this pre-pictorial and this anti-representational position, And it's through this use of the word entre-deux, which is where she writes from. The word entre-deux, it is a word I used recently in Deluge to designate a true in-between, between a life which is ending and a life which is beginning. For me, an entre-deux is nothing, but it is, I will go through metaphors, a moment in a life where you're not entirely living, where you're almost dead, where you're not dead, where you're not yet in the process of reliving. These are the innumerable moments that touch us with bereavements of all sorts. Either there's bereavement between me, violently, from the loss of being who is part of me, as if a piece of my body, of my house, were ruined or collapsed. Or, for example, the bereavement that the appearance of a grave illness in oneself must be. Everything that makes the course of life becomes interrupted. In this case, we find ourselves in a situation for which we are absolutely not prepared. Human beings are equipped for daily life, with its rights, with its closure, its commodities, its furniture. When an event arrives which evicts us from ourselves, we do not know how to live, but we must. Thus, we are launched into a space-time whose coordinates are all different from those we have always been accustomed to. In addition, these violent situations are always new, always. At no moment can a previous bereavement serve as a model. It is frightfully all new. This is one of the most important experiences of our human histories. At times, we are thrown into strangeness. This being abroad at home is what I call an entre-deux. Wars cause entre-deux in the histories of countries, but the worst war is the war where the enemy is on the inside, where the enemy is the person that I love the most in the world, which is myself. This is her answer to where she writes from. This is partly why Cece was the best living writer. But it is an important acknowledgement, akin to Cézanne's chaos gray point, as the importance of remaining in between. I don't want to romanticize loss, but this is also pagan painting. Painting seems to require some kind of bloodletting or sacrifice of self, or at the very least a kind of strangeness we allow ourselves to be opened up to. It's my opinion that we're in a time when there are many works on canvas, many images done with paint, but there are very few paintings, maybe only 100. I half mean that. Okay, so now I want to talk about myself a little bit, so that's open to critique too, because I come at things from a position that I come at them from. I went into grad school really thinking about the work of the pictures generation, but also how pop art handled and continues to handle painting. For me, it was interesting then to know when a painting understands itself as an image or as a thing of material. I also was interested in limits, like when a painting wanted to be a stage or a space to lean something against. I went into grad school thinking about this strange moment when James Rosenquist seemed almost bored with painting, to the point of turning it into a system or a kind of theater, like this work Conveyor done in 1964. I got there in 2012, and looking back on it, I realized there was a time in painting still really shaped by the '08 crash. From my perspective, that time was characterized primarily by three camps: provisional painting as outlined by Raphael Rubinstein, post-internet art, and something that never really had a name or an ism, but what I would now characterize as artists who used painting in a way that flirted with installation, who wanted to possess it with the language of backdrops or scenes for performance. I also saw it as a way to introduce props or to perform as myself. This was also a time when we weren't afraid of the word irony. Irony was an important tool within painting. I remember realizing during that time that irony is not the opposite of sincerity, and realizing sincerity is a far trickier word than irony is, in my opinion. I remember a group panel that was put together when I was there with some big painters and curators at the time, and they explicitly said that a mark in a painting can no longer index a romantic sense of mastery. There we go. A flourish or bravura should be introduced at a moment of mechanics, and what should appear to be effortless should be incredibly manufactured, and what seemed casual should hide the miraculous. This is irony, not pastiche, because it unsettles expectations with a political or conceptual framework in mind. And this is still what I'm working through. I start from a place of not understanding. All right. The idea that began this painting was about tenderness. Sorry, I can't find it. There it is. The idea that began this painting was about tenderness towards something I can't know, and in this case, it's learning to braid the hair of DJ Horse Girl. I don't understand anything about her. What I was interested with her is that whether or not her choice to wear horse prosthetics while she DJs, whether it's a fetish or a deeply incorporated into her identity, or just a gimmick or a marketing ploy, it ultimately doesn't matter to me. Sometimes the most deeply incorporated sense of self, unedited desire or fetish, reads as spectacle from the outside, and I find that really interesting. And what can we do but learn tenderness and maybe learn how to braid the hair of something we don't understand? Jan Verwoerd would describe irony as the ability to laugh while crying or cry while laughing. It is political and insightful disappointment. It is Harmony Korine adopting the aesthetics of homeschooled kids, of kids with Thrasher t-shirts and Whitney Houston tattoos who form solipsistic cultures within themselves, along with their own critique and their own choices. In the 80s and 90s, the stance allowed for what was referred to as demystification, processes of revealing power so as to deconstruct and critique it. And I'm really suspicious of how much of that we've lost. When art and painting felt like it had hit a dead end, artists began using it towards self-deprecation and anti-monumental strategies and self-doubt. In hopes of better revealing power structures, artists began earnestly asking, what gives us the right? Am I authorized to be here and do this? This is a different call from artists that have gone so far into self-valorizing that they believe themselves to be a cultural or worse political leader. This is also why I don't like immersion within galleries and museums. So here's where I want to get into details and then into corpsing. Both get us to the importance of irony within painting. Yeah, there we go. And return us into the gray point, the in-between, of knowing that painting requires. In 1997, the French critic Daniel Arras wrote a book on how the detail functions within painting, and his thesis is that we fundamentally misunderstand and misapprehend what a detail represents within a painting. A detail doesn't cherish anything, instead it ruptures. When we are looking at this other painting by Fra Angelico, Scenes from the Lives of the Desert Fathers, each detail makes us question the concept of time within the painting. Its accumulation doesn't lead to believability. Instead, it strains our imagination to believe that a funeral is taking place next to a family working in a garden, while monks discover and prove the existence of dragons nearby. It became fashionable to say that painting is a precursor to film, and it is formally, but a film doesn't layer time in this way. You don't have multiple temporalities within the same scene or image. The detail for Fra Angelico makes life into a compendium or stratified time, where the mystic lives within the same world as death, within the same world of the mundane chore. George D.D. Huberman wrote about this painting by Vermeer, the lace maker. In it, there is this weird shock of vermilion that Vermeer painted that never turns into anything legible. Svetlana Alpers wrote about it, saying it was a flaw in the camera obscura that Vermeer was committed to as a scientist painter. But D.D. Huberman saw it as an intentional act of abstraction, saying Vermeer wanted to create a rupture within the painting, to open it up, to remind us of how easily it would be to make a painting of complete chaos, yet he didn't. All the contrivance that goes into making a painting into a form of illusion. Often details are used to remind you of the decisions and labor of the painter, but they also shade darker meanings, both within looking and also morality. In this image by Artemisia Genilescu, The Conversion of St. Mary Magdalene, the painter paints what is possibly a self-portrait, an updated Mary Magdalene posed in modern dress, but also reveals Mary Magdalene's pearl earring in the reflection of the mirror nearby that sits in front of a skull. Did I lose? No, there you go. The more the earring detail functions as an enticement, the more we notice that it is entangled in death. In this case, it is the vanitas of luxury, but it is also the vanitas of looking itself, of painting itself. It seems to say that the act of looking at painting might also be a form of death itself. It is interesting, too, to question what constitutes a detail. We generally associate detail with something small, a trace or a glimpse within the field, but the detail is not necessarily connected to scale. and there are cases where detail is used to disrupt composition and narrative. There's this painting by George de la Tour, The Denial of St. Peter, where the namesake of the painting is crowded to the left edge, and the actual event of the scene is the soldiers gambling at a table. The action of the painting is a MacGuffin, but why? This is done in the Caravaggia style, where the main sense of the composition is delayed or hidden from us. But de la Tour is suggesting maybe that history or miracles are things that we are probably too distracted to witness. The world is filled with painfully beautiful illusions and wonders of deep pathos and tragedy, but we have to look up from our phones to actually see them. And here's a painting by J.S. Duplessis, his painting of Gabrielle de Raymond de Modane. In the painting, the artist painted the sitter with a fly on her face, right next to her lip. It is a detail that ruptures the very nature of what a portrait is, reminds us of all the portraits we've seen that communicate that they are a direct form of naturalism. The fly makes us realize all the flies we haven't seen depicted in these sessions, the contrivance that goes into making even the most basic image. A detail, then, is a form of irony. It is closer to a demolition of an image than something of its framework. It is a meta step, a step outside of the immersive reality of the painting in hopes that you, the viewer, can be let in on the joke for a second, so that you can see all the work that goes into making these dreams. For me, this all translates that painting is a palimpsest, that images, painting, and the body form a sensual matrix together. They all enact virtual experiences, but they're experiences that typically don't add up to anything. They undermine each other, if anything. I am asking questions with my work like, how do you give a circulating image a sense of weight? How do you give it presence or make it specific to a place? How do you rematerialize an image? And how does a detail function within a painting now? How do you make up a body made of images or a body as interface? A body mapped by the thought patterns and trajectories of attention. With the gravity drop and feel of the infinite downward scroll of the feed, with corporate logos and defense contractors and private consulting firms that trend forecast the future. What would an update of the chimerical forms of the Renaissance grotesque look like? And maybe, more pressingly, do our phones make us all grotesque? I think of the figures in each of my paintings as composite portraits of multiple people, living and dead, known and unknown, usually beginning with an observational painting of someone I care about and blurring them with something different. And this often becomes a flirtation with archetype and allegory. I'm inspired by A.B. Warburg's pathos formulae, that every gesture seen in painting was a reference and annotation to another painting, and another like actors cast in multiple roles. In these early paintings, I was interested in translucency as a formal way of depicting the immaterial feelings of virtual space. I wanted to make spaces that were translucent, but then spiky and heavy with texture and moments that rupture the screen. Currently, I paint cosplayers who are occupying multiple landscapes at once and wearing avant-garde runway fashion from the last 30 years that were made from speculations on the future. I have rules to these paintings. They can't depict anyone famous, but they can depict one-hit wonders. They can't depict anyone who believes they are currently being themselves. Otherwise, I can only depict people I don't understand. And I can only use dead aesthetics or things that attempted to become aesthetics that failed, discontinued fashion, rejected logos, and discontinued technology. I think about paintings as a kind of sculpture with images. I think of Jamiroquai, who's pictured here, as an intense but short flash of eccentric color and tone. I think of a tattoo as heavy and permanent. I think of a cross as something airy and translucent. I think of a broken arm cast as something dumb. Using these personal materialisms, I try to make a painting that balances permanence and impermanence, circulation, and deep memory. So then this got me to my most recent work, but first we need to introduce corpsing to get there. Corpsing is a term found within acting when an actor falls out of a character and is no longer believable as the character they're trying to portray. Keanu Reeves is a really great corpser. It is usually followed by laughter or a quick release of affect. To quote David Marriott here, he says, while I entirely agree that corpsing is usually determined rhetorically as a kind of excessive body over representation, I also insist that the whole scandal of corpsing, its impure force, lies in the spectacle of what happens when the most self-present mastery of representation comes across that which is both unaskable and unrepresentable. First, insofar as corpsing reveals a discord, it is not clear from the metaphor whether corpsing denotes a failure to repress or the pleasure of failed repression, a pleasure that is also a death. I'm interested in how this excessive body over representation relates to painting, because that also describes a painting. This impure force that Marriott describes is also a way of dealing with paint. Corpsing then is another formal irony, an expression of failure that denies the rigidity of performativity. It is when a portrait fails or flickers when mimesis is transgressed. It can be humorous, but within the realm of painting, it can also become political. By dropping out of the illusion, we can see the architecture of the illusion itself. There we go. I remember seeing this painting by Marlene Dumas in Amsterdam at the Stedelijk Museum right before the COVID lockdown and being truly haunted by it. It is embarrassing that she could paint bin Laden more beautifully than I can paint a loved one. Carolee Schneemann says that blue is the most agile of colors, that it can shift to vivid greens, it can accommodate red to make elusive violets, it speeds along with almost every color on the palette, and unlike most colors of the palette, resists the earth, the neutral or beigey grays. In this way, blue is often the color of the spiritual world, the lagoon and the grotto, resisting the earth to float above it, a color that Yves Klein became obsessed with for these material and transcendent qualities. In the painting done in 2010, almost a year before bin Laden would be killed, his face becomes a lake of blue and green that shifts to sulfur. It is like a landscape situated in the face. It is soft and small, something that could be carried under the arm. Easily stolen, smaller than a poster, with brass tacks pinning down the sides of the linen to the frame. It seems to be loosely based off of an image of bin Laden that the FBI used when they placed him on the most wanted list, taken from an interview he gave in 1998 after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, but before the September 11th attacks, which then makes this an image of a man between terrorist attacks, perhaps already holding on to a lethal secret that only he knew was being planned. But the longer you look at this image, the more it starts to get away from you. The longer you look at it, the more it doesn't look like him. The nose isn't shaped right at all. In her painting, it's rounder and more cartoonish and doesn't get any of the angles of the nose bin Laden had. The shape of the eyes seems invented, and the mouth is wrong. Dumas has painted the top lip light. The shape of the eyes making it seem exaggerated, more pronounced, pushing ahead of the bottom lip, and turning the mouth into something crude or possibly injected. Dumas addresses the shape of the face and its relationship to the edge through her characteristic spill, oiling and spreading the paint around into a pool of soft color. It's a sinking of paint, and marks registering above the sinking. The obvious question is, why did she choose to paint this subject, of all subjects? More importantly, why did she paint this subject the way that she did, and in such an enigmatic way? Dumas' practice is trying to open up the image of painting and its belief system by introducing her own kind of intellectual forgery, or the shared symbiosis between them. The reason is to address the content collapse of images, their swarm and proliferation, to question how far you can change someone while keeping our recognition of them. Corpsing within the portrait is a direct challenge to mimesis, and by extension to the world of dreams, and then to the world of magic. Here's where I think it is important to bring up Giordano Bruno and what image magic means, because images do have a strange relationship to painting. Images and magic have always had a closer relationship, though. In fact, they share the same root word. Magic, etymologically, comes from the Persian Magoth, who the Greeks would call the Magi. They were magicians whose magic existed primarily in the interpretation of dreams and the promise to bind the spiritual world from influencing the physical one. Imago, the root word of the image, branches off of the Greek word for magi and comes from the same deep and conscious memory, and understanding that the illusion of images and the illusion of magic are always bound together. The Greeks used the word eidolon for speaking of ghosts, which roughly translates into spirit images. Giordano Bruno, a mystic who was burned at the stake in 1600, was interested in what discerned a magic image from a normal one. Some images, like the alchemical images of Michael Meyer, or the Atalanta Fugins, or the Splendor Solis, or the Ripley Scroll, have a way of burning themselves into our minds and existing as eidetic forms. Specifically, Bruno was interested in image magic and how we could bind our memory into images. His memory wheel presages what would later become memory palaces in attaching ideas to images and using images to have a sense of memory. According to Bruno, magic from the Magoth incorporated three things: the interpretation of dreams, the binding of spiritual forces, and the transfer of energy and ideas. It is this last one that is particularly relevant here. The ability to transfer an image from one mind to another through painting has been a deeply held tenet of magic since its inception. If we were to show the Persian magicians a meme shared from a cell phone to a cell phone through either Instagram or AirDrop or Wi-Fi, they would certainly describe it as a form of magic. The opposition to this image sending within magic is binding, which is a Hermetic and pagan principle found even within the Bible. Later, this would again be summarized in the phrase, as above, so below, in the Emerald Tablet. If we then extend the sharing of images to the language and definition of magic previously understood in ancient worlds, then what does it mean to be so immersed in this magic, so over-attenuated, so hyper-steeped within images, that their individual meanings break down and we can no longer remember them? Peter Lamborn Wilson and McLuhan both made the connection that Bruno's image magic now exists in culture through advertising and commercials. The way that a Coke commercial is not intended to make you desire to drink a Coke as you are watching the commercial, but instead want one 3 to 5 days later, when you're experiencing an unfamiliar familiar that had been set up and conditioned by the Coke commercial. Painting is also a form of image magic, an imprint from the artist to the viewer of an interior space felt by the artist. This has been an epistemological argument for painting that is the opposite of marketing, but may contain the same ability to inform memory in a different way. But the misapprehension of that translation, which some would call irony or others might call a dark spell, disrupts reality as we interact with it. It forms entre-deux of misunderstanding within this expectation. At times I look at this painting and think that it is trying to cultivate a kind of macro-scale empathy, reminding me that bin Laden had lungs like we do, and teeth and eyes and desires and nightmares just like us. But I ultimately don't think that Dumas is trying to cultivate some kind of empathy with bin Laden. Instead, I think she's showing how easily bin Laden's face can lose shape, can become someone else's face, can deteriorate in the same way that people trying to describe a suspect to a forensic artist can. I'm amazed at how I recognize this as bin Laden in the first place, but the longer I look, the more I realize it isn't even close. Dumas has blended his face with ghosts we don't have access to. She is transferring an undisclosed specific that challenges the boundary of what makes an image look like one of bin Laden and what makes it break into something else. Through painting, Dumas is able to show us that the trauma and the nightmare can easily shift back and forth between each other. We can see its reflections on innocent subjects and see its face everywhere. Traumatized victims can see their attackers in crowds and can enact public and racialized fear because of it. This is what corpsing can do in painting, is reveal that there are very public concepts of recognition and subjectivity. They are haunted. The individual of romanticism is constantly undergoing personas and characters and perceiving the world through valences of their own embodied experience. In this other painting she did of bin Laden, done in 2006, entitled The Pilgrim, we're able to see a more severe challenge to the integrity of the subject. This is barely recognizable as bin Laden, yet still is exhibited in the office of Gallery Paul Andreas during her show to possibly avoid controversy. There is a form of magic subterfuge that a gallery can acknowledge that a painting of someone looking nothing like bin Laden could be mistaken for bin Laden by a general public. It's the painting on the right. This is some baseline acknowledgement of either public paranoia or public stereotyping and racism, one that Dumas' hybrid portraits are able to explore the buried lines of. The fact that Dumas tried bin Laden again 4 years later is telling. Controversy didn't create sobriety for her. Instead, there was something there worth revisiting. The first try seems like more of a caricature, feels angrier in some ways. The eyes are drifting apart, and there's a kind of Elmer Fudd shape to the head. The painting that I saw at the Shed Lake was at least the second try, and closer to bin Laden. It was only after looking at it on my phone, ironically, much later, that I began to notice that the image barely seemed to look at the image of bin Laden at all after it had been started. With the second painting, Dumas seems more detached, able to engage with a mystical or alchemical visual experiment of unfamiliar and familiar. She is able to be more ambivalent and treat the subject the way Rothenberg addressed the horse or Johns addressed the flag, just as a formal engagement to experiment with. Her painting feels familiar to Warhol's 13 Most Wanted Men that he exhibited at the New York Pavilion during the World's Fair in 1964. The men weren't criminals or suspects at all. The mural was painted over with aluminum paint before the World's Fair opened, which some have argued was an intentional part of the practice. Dumas' false portraits also reclaim the sense of schema within portraiture. The historical position of portraiture has always been about the careful balance of realism and schema, of painting the king as recognizable while also exaggerating him to be recognizable as a culturally legible image of authority. Painting the moment Napoleon could also pass as a Roman marble bust or as a Caesar. Dumas taking the schema, or the culturally conferred aspect of the portrait, and making it intimate and unknowable, unpublic in all of the right ways. It is reminiscent of this series by Sigmar Polk, who used drone images from a missile heading to a rider on a camel, revealing that the closer you get to the thing itself, the less you really know. It's a series of three. I could only find this one, but it starts to rupture into just dots. The idea of killing someone while thinking that you can know them, ultimately this is the closest we can understand. Another form of corpsing can be found in the work of Lynette, Yaddo, and Boaki, who cleverly and ironically enters into the aesthetic of observational painting, but every figure she depicts is completely invented and imagined. This can only be done by an intense exercise of the hand to conceptually adopt and rehearse an aesthetic so that things appear to be perceived when they never were. This form of corpsing also demonstrates the contrivance of painting the portrait in all of its romantic notions, at the expense of displaying that we often arrive at the conventional forms of aesthetics that observational painting often takes. Here we go. This is a concept that I was missing within my own work. My interest in persona, cosplay, and performativity hadn't yet incorporated ways for the mask to slip. I began this series of performances where I wanted to consider a conversation as a form of sculpture. Bald Anders gets its name from a German being that Borges wrote about, who changed its shape over the length of a conversation. Each performance begins with an invitation. I ask someone that I've had a deep conversation with who they would like to channel over the course of a conversation, and then we spend a year talking to each other, recording every version of our conversation and making script after script after script. Based on their answer to my question, I do a life cast of them, I do a silicone rubber mold, and I build prosthetics for them to become this. This is me and Fong Bui talking to each other at Anton Kern. Fong chose Immanuel Kant as the person that he wanted to be transformed into while we were talking, and I chose William Blake to meet his idea of definitions with irrational and romantic prophecy and visions. I wanted the artist talk or the interview to become its own kind of theater, to see the lectern and the microphone and all of the apparatus that generate power and authority in the setting of an artist talk within a gallery. Recently at Blade Study, I interviewed Angela Dufresne and Andrew Ross, who became Shuli Firestone and Baudrillard. For Shuli, I became Picabia, and for Baudrillard, I became Bam Margera, because I wanted to balance his metaphysics on sculpture with pure physics. While the show at Blade Study was based on these performance artist interviews, I introduced a new element into the practice. These are some of the prosthetic casts that I've done in the past up on that shelf. These are collages that I generated that were based on the theories that came out of the conversations. There's Fong. Everyone I do a cast of, I place in this vitrine or this ball donner's cabinet here. So everyone I've ever spoken to in regards to it stays. There's me talking to Angela and looking totally normal. I don't know why I do this. I like starting from a position that I have to dig myself out of. I like starting from a stupid point and then trying to say something hopefully interesting. I also like dragging the people I love through that experience. I don't know why, but I like seeing maybe that like her and I and the people I care about can suffer through something together, be on the inside of something together and see what comes out the other side. I'm very thankful for my friends who let me do this to them. But I like the tenderness that comes through of me helping Angela with her makeup. And that's her ripping it all off very happily at the end. There's me as Bam and Andrew Ross, an amazing sculptor, as Jean Baudrillard. Again, looking very normal. And I also feel like I always do the prosthetics better for the person I'm talking to. I've got to work that out, but I feel like I do a better job. This was a or a postcard rack I put together of all the theories of painting that are based on the conversations between me and Andrew. They were free to take. It was meant to be sent to a painter or sculptor who's in trouble, which we all are, so free to grab. This is basically my idea of a chalkboard. Throughout the run of the show, I would pin up images and remind myself the times, and also would remind people that came in when the performances would happen. One of the theories, legible, another legible theory. And here's where I want to get to. Here's how I bring it back to painting. I really became interested in the idea that portrait sitting has only really existed in art history as this romantic concept of empathy between the painter and the subject. And I was interested in what it meant to add a layer of mediation and interruption to that. Rather than a close channel of empathy, I was balancing everything with what I thought William Blake would do. Constantly aware of choice and subjectivity, I painted people as they came into the gallery. I'm constantly aware of the performative aspects of painting someone a la prima. It became its own kind of bodily excess, a challenge to align, a challenge to paint someone as I desired to paint them, but also as William Blake might have wanted, dragged back from hell, a constant corpsing that continues the integrity of the romantic notion of painting or challenges it. Painting engineers the way we see things from the materials and experience of the world, and it does it through this material. I think of this painting that was originally attributed to Artemisia Gentilescu, but is now considered to be done by one of her students. It is an allegory for painting, where the painter sleeps peacefully and is perceived while dreaming. It's something I wish I could have, but often don't. Painting is a dreaming or imaging in public. I think that's brilliant. The artist here is naked and sleeping, totally unaware of us as she dreams, totally vulnerable. Dreaming in public, dreaming and unaware of the audience, the patron, even other painters. At any given time, there will be a panel titled something to the effect of "Why Painting Now?" The real answer is that they found pigments in caves going back 100,000 years, and painting as a cultural technology is almost impossible to imagine ending. Painting is simultaneous to thought and interiority, and it may even predate language. The question is, how do we get to this pre-pictorial idea of painting, while also keeping the dream of it alive? How do we dream and remain vulnerable with each other through what we make? And I think that the detail and corpsing of falling in and out of the dream and earnestness and irony are two ways of doing that. Avoiding cliche and also avoiding the self-valorizing position of the romantic individual who alone can address the issues of the world. The concept of the individual is not just killing us, it's completely unsustainable and making each other miserable. I wanted to end on this final painting of Marlene Dumas called The Painter in 1994. She depicts an avatar of herself as a child, hands covered in paint, coming from somewhere else, where she's smearing paint like a cave painter. The hands become the brushes. The pose is, should I be here? Should I run away? Which makes us the audience, the scolder, the authoritarian. We're about to punish the bad child, the bad artist, the painter for making yet another crude smear. Smearing is one of the most primordial of painting techniques. We want to smear things when they aren't working. We want to smear them to create movement or abstraction, but then what? We can quickly be in a position of solving smears with other smears and lose the whole painting, getting into the grayness and the chaos point of Cézanne. The painter here is vulnerable too, challenged and challenging, ready to run, but maybe ready to stand their ground. The painter isn't afraid of the chaos of the gray, but they stay within the condition of unknowing, of entre-nous, of in-between. Painting is humiliating and vulnerable. I know many painters who have cried during or after the experience of painting. We all do. Every mark is just there. You can be held accountable for every decision and be asked, why is that mark there and not there? That color is awful. Why did you pick it? Don't they know composition? It's been done before. I've had students cry during critiques without knowing why. I've cried during critiques when I was a student. And I've seen Albert Erlin cry at the end of a painting. It is the vulnerability of every mark that we cannot explain away, ironize, or distance ourselves from. It is our own bodies and arm angles and hand movements on display for everyone to see. When confronted with a crisis of belief, of machinic learning, algorithmic and search engine art tailored to individual desires to further disrupt and destroy the public commons, we have our own vulnerability as our ability, an ancient and revolutionary vulnerability as painters to stand our ground and open up new channels. Everything gets let in. The excess, or the things that can never be depicted, are what makes painting resist the commodified and exploitative systems of AI images and machine-based creativity. When Giacometti was asked by Jean Genet what to do with his sculptures after he passed, Berger tells us he responded, burn them in the earth to find a place between the living and the dead. Like Giacometti, we have to find a space for the images we see in between immanence and transcendence, and painting is that grave, that space that other things can't get to, between the slipstream without memory and without permanence. Our ability to dream and be vulnerable while dreaming, to stand against naturalism and uncover our tracks for each other, allow us to open ourselves to the world around us and invite a sensuous in-between where calculation threatens to replace it. That's it. What do I do?
You wait for someone to raise their hand and ask a question. Does anyone have a question? Great.
Yeah.
Perfect.
See you. Great.
I'm curious about the process of making the prosthetics on the face.
Super easy.
It's easy. Do you just use a silicone and you just kind of mold it, or what?
Try to keep it short. It's a really difficult process. Within art, sometimes I have a confidence I don't always have in the rest of my life. And for some reason, I thought I could just teach myself how to do that process. And it's a very extensive one. It's also very gate-kept. The first show at Anton Kern, I had 4 months to learn how to do it, which is not advisable. Like, prosthetics is usually intended to be done with a team of like 20 people. It's made for Hollywood. I did it with myself. Hi, Frankie. Myself and a friend of mine, an assistant, Obad El Jeffrey, we worked on it. And then I pestered everyone I could find who did prosthetics to learn like 1/10 of the process from each of them, because no one wanted to tell me the whole thing. But basically, you start with a life cast, you start with a positive that's done in like concrete or ultra cow. You then start clay sculpting on top of that form. And then you do more molds to get every detail you can out of that clay. And then the basic process, and this sounds easy, but it's incredibly difficult, is pushing the original positive of how someone looks into this face that you made for them. And the negative is what generates the silicone rubber. But then there are all these really fun little tricks. It's very alchemical. It has to be the right temperature, has to be down to the gram. It's a recipe that people don't want to tell you, and I had to lie and act like I already knew to hear how it worked. And you have to encapsulate the silicone, because silicone doesn't stick to the skin. So you have to like cover it in this very thin plastic to make it work. And that's a recipe that also no one wants to tell you. So it was fun, and somehow we got it to work. I do not know how. If I could go back in time and tell myself how difficult of a process it was, I probably wouldn't have tried. But I was like, how hard can this be? Really hard. But also, I really want to tell everyone how to do it. So if you have questions, I can, because it shouldn't be gate-kept. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious, you spoke a little bit about painting as a process of discovery, painting things that you don't understand or don't want to know. You're also in a position, because of the roles you have, I mean, you just gave a talk that was very conceptually framed. You write, you curate, you teach, and all of those things are normally sort of preoccupied with the transference of a certain knowledge. And I'm wondering how you operate in the tension between those positions, that of an intellect about art and artist discoverer.
Christ. First of all, I'm not on trial here. No, I'm kidding. That's an awesome question. And also, I hope no punches are pulled. I was trying to write this in a way that there was disagreement. Like, I took hard positions I hope some of you don't like. It's tough. I have to like compartmentalize everything in my life. Like, I spend a week writing and I spend a week painting. I can't write when I'm in the studio, and I can't like, my studio has no internet, has no ability to get on my phone or access images. I don't read anything. I don't look at anything. I have to kind of like go into the space of like trying to get connected to my hand and the body. And then I have this whole other stupid thing that I do of writing and thinking about art. And I have to read for like 2 or 3 days, like poetry and a little bit of art history and theory, just to get into the rhythm of like thinking that way again. But I found it took me a long time to realize that the mind that works for being a painter is pretty antagonistic to the mind that works to like conceptualism. And I really tried to square that for a long time. There are conceptual painters out there, like Jennifer Bartlett. They're like people that find a way to kind of get conceptual process, or even Marlene Dumas in some ways. But I think it like really comes for her embodied way of working through painting that she arrives at it. But I think like the more you try to set out to do a thing with painting, the more you end up with an illustration, not a painting. And the more knowledge you try to put into it, the more it becomes a picture rather than a painting. So like I try to keep certain types of ideas out of the studio when I'm working. Did that answer that? I don't know. It's tricky.
I have a question, Andrew.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm trying to mix like 3 questions together, but I guess it's, you mentioned that the idea of the individual is unsustainable.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that it is inevitable that that idea goes away? Or that the concept of the individual goes away if it is unsustainable? Or do you think it just mutates?
I don't think so. I mean, like, I think that, like, it's probably, I mean, like, I would love to think that. Like, I would love to be an optimist and think that collectivity becomes more of a thing, and, like, we stop caring about who we are as individuals and we start caring about the people around us more. You know, and obviously I'm part of Below Grand, and it's about finding solutions between 24 of us on how to run a gallery, and I'm more interested in that. But things keep getting worse right now, and I'd like to imagine that there's some way that we pull up and start thinking about how unsustainable, like, everyone yelling individually about what they want to create in the studio is, and find collective practices as much as we can and try to give platforms to other people as much as we can. I hope within the art world it's getting away from singular authorship. I think that'd be cool. But I think that the more we get exploited and the more that we are traumatized, I think the answer instead is to, like, build your own platform, become an influencer, market the way you smell, market other things, you know, to have the illusion or the mirage that you can get outside of this if you're interesting enough. You know, and I don't know if it's the same conversation like 20 years ago, but I think that influencers have really changed the whole thing for being an artist in some ways. That, like, a lot of artists that I interact with, the way they talk about their work is interchangeable with the way an influencer would. Building your audience, finding ways of developing a style that is recognizable and brandable. These are just things of painting that I've never been interested in, and don't really have an interest in trying to evolve into, you know. I think it's more important to become mysterious to myself, and I hope everyone, you know, that's what I'm interested in. Is that an answer? Yeah, and then John.
Hey, everybody's questions are really smart. I don't know, this one maybe is, I'm shy now.
No. Go.
I was thinking about, like, okay, when you're painting, I was wondering if you could talk about, like, the feeling of, like, when something feels right. Like, when you put something down and it, or do you have a feeling that you go with, like, when you're working on something, to keep it from being a picture or to keep it from being, like, content? Do you have a feeling, like, on the canvas where you're like, yeah, I avoided it?
That was such a better question than Jacob's. I thought Jacob asked a really bad question, and he should be ashamed of himself. And I thought you asked, like, the best question. I'm just kidding. Yeah, right. I love that. I mean, I think that, like, it's really cool when you can surprise yourself, when you do something that is, like, not the conventional way of doing something, you figure out a new way of doing it. It's really great when I can't describe something I've done, you know, where I think that, like, oftentimes within my art, and then obviously with the sculptural performances, like, the more uncomfortable I can make myself, the better. This made me feel like shit. I was very ashamed of it. It was awful for people to walk into the gallery and experience me that way. There are a few people I did portraits of that didn't get to see me and look at me first. This is their first interaction with me as a human being. And now I've been reintroduced to them. So uncomfortability is, like, really important. Like my studio is a place of, like, the more I feel like I'm fulfilling the idea or the answers I already know how to do, the more I feel like I'm stagnating, you know. So, and, like, how that formally looks is, like, wet into wet accidental painting feels really good, you know, like getting outside of the academic training of, like, mixing everything on the palette first. That's important too, but, like, also, like, just being like, this thing I'm about ready to do will be permanent, and I don't fully know what it's going to do. Like, creating events within painting is, like, really, like, a language I guess I think about, like an event that I can't fix. That answer, hopefully. Cool.
I have a follow-up.
Awesome. God.
I think some of the things you're talking about and some of the questions sort of refer to a kind of idea that you're presenting, which is itself kind of romantic, which is that you're in kind of conflict.
Come on.
And no, we're going for it, man. You said you wanted some hard questions.
Come on. Yeah.
However, to counter that, I'd say what you just described and answering the previous question is this kind of feeling of commensurability that stands in opposition to that. And that maybe something that painting offers, it's not that it's in dynamic opposition to conceptual thinking, but it's isomorphic to it. In other words, painting is one way of looking at thought, just as thought is one way of looking at painting. And that's our time.
I'll say that like maybe it is a romantic notion in its own way, but like incommensurability is more interesting to me than commensurability, or like, again, irony of like difference, of like two things that don't belong to each other working together is like always more interesting. Like three people singing out of key, but they weirdly hit a harmony is like something I think about within art and painting and everything, of like untalented or unskilled things that deliver a moment that is unexpected. And maybe that is romantic in its own way, probably. But that's not the point. I'm supposed to put out a position and you're supposed to say you're wrong, and you did that. So that's very good. What was the other part of the question? Like how mapping ways of thinking? Yeah, it's just my way of thinking, Like my way of thinking is that like I feel like I have a part of my mind that is always trying to erase mystery and always have answers. And art in my practice is a way of doing something sometimes in public before I know fully what it's going to do, and like trying to get comfortable with that space of tension, So like that is a way of thinking through embodied experience I get to do, but it works for me and not everyone. That do it? Cool. John.
Yeah, I want to throw a little monkey wrench into the mix here.
God damn it, John.
Speaking of things that no one wanted to talk about or tell you, what did you say about the prosthetic thing? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you talked a great deal about philosophy, theory, spirituality.
Sure.
Although I didn't see any of these paintings, but I know you've made a lot of paintings with Christ figures and religious kinds of, what about religion?
Oh, God.
I was going to do that too, but...
I didn't know we were going to get on the couch and talk about our feelings. That's fair. Let's be vulnerable. I grew up in a very religious background that I process, that I feel like is a productive place of ironic tension with me. Both the symbolic forms of belief and how it gets acted out in ritual and material, it's totally there. It took me a long time to see it, which was really embarrassing. I had a visiting artist when I was in grad school. I was making these abstract paintings, and he came in and he said, grew up in a religious household. And I was like, what? And he was right. Relationship to symmetry that was coming through in this super tight thing that I was trying to get out through painting, like based on the grid. And then it was like trying to bring in muddiness, perversity. Frankie, it's so crushing. But yeah, it's there. Like I think the faith is in looking. For me, there's a relationship between suffering, and I guess that's how I currently deal with the images of like the crucifix, is that it's an empathy channel to suffering. To me, it's like not a belief system that I partake in, but it's a symbol of painting reminds us of each other's suffering. And where to go with that? That's, it's a channel of empathy, and I think painting itself is like not to get too modernist with it, but painting itself is the kind of modernist church for me, or like the ability to look and translate and put something down on surface that is a virtual experience that someone else gets to maybe pick up on and then push back on, is where meaning feels like it resides for me. Is that, man, now I'm getting all romantic.
We'll do one more.
All
We'll
right.
do one really hard one.
Come on. Thanks, Phil. That'll be a hard one.
I don't know if I can give you a hard one.
That'll get me.
But I'll give you an interpretation and a question. My interpretation, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that like there's an argument in your talk that's something like we normally think of honesty and earnestness as one,
Yeah.
and irony is something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the kind of one of the thrusts of your talk is that, in fact, irony should be considered as closer to honesty than earnestness is. Earnestness is something like individual, resources coming to bear on a problem, ignoring the sort of like collective flux that has formed your perception. And irony is something a little bit more honest about that.
I feel like I just wasted everyone's time. I didn't need to talk for an hour. That's kind of basically it. I very quickly, because we need to go drink, but I don't know what the word sincerity means. Like, I think we're incapable of doing something outside of our way of thinking about doing it, like, unless we're talking about like motor skills or doing things without thinking, like we're always sincerely doing the thing we thought we'd like to do. I equate earnestness with homogeneous or a homogeneity of like trying to make everything assimilate into your idea of self and your worldview. And like coming from 80s postmodernism, I'm just like difference is the whole thing, like incorporating the other and understanding and sympathy and empathy for the other. Like that's where we have a chance to grow and regenerate and become something different, So like that's irony for me, which is going towards the opposite to find where the harmony is between the opposites. And when people discuss their work through sincerity and earnestness, that sounds like a solipsistic, individualized worldview that doesn't maybe let the world in. And that's harsh. I know not everyone means it that way. But like, yeah, I think irony is like utopic. And I think sincerity is sometimes used in the language of like authoritarianism, of like finding the authentic self. And while we all find out what that authentic self is, whether it's a type of clothing or whether it's a book or whether it's like a skateboard or whatever it is, as long as we chase the authentic self, we're denying our ability to get to know one another through difference. So, pro-irony, but interested in earnest irony or the way irony fails into maybe romanticism.
I think that's fairly consistent with the way Deleuze uses the word irony as well.
Yeah.
But here's my question.
I thought I got out of one.
Understanding you're trying to avoid romantic cliches, that there does seem to be a deontic dimension to this sort of like irony is honest. There's a should there. One should be honest about where one comes from. So my question is why? How is a painter being honest about their kind of fractured subjective position in the ironic kind of the irony of that position? How is that? How are you trying to save the world, Andrew?
I mean, by avoiding that question and avoid, I mean, like, again, I don't know why I'm working it out, but like I just really love starting from, and it's very easy for me, starting from a very stupid position and a very embarrassing position and then trying to fix it. Like that's just like how I have to make art. It's how I have to make a painting. It's how I have to make a sculpture. Like I just have to start from the negative and see if I can do something interesting or poetic from that place of self-annihilation or demolition or humiliation or whatever it is. And like, for me, the latest work, or Balldonders, is like deeply humiliating. It's weird. I don't like doing performances, but feeling and being so strange in public, and then trying to like lock in with the person I've been working with for a year and talk to them and say something and hear them and ask them the right question at the right moment feels like really exciting to get over my own embarrassment. I think that's what's really is. With like, if I sit in the chair looking like a monster, that's not an interesting piece to me. But if I'm so weighed down by the way I look, but it doesn't matter because the person next to me is what matters, and making sure that they look good and their questions are answered makes me supersede that concept of like, how do I look and what, it's not about me, you know? So like, it's, yeah, I don't think I could, yeah, I would never try to world save or make anything better. I think I'm just trying to like start stupid and maybe see if something interesting comes from that dumb place. And there's probably a relationship to comedy, you know? It's like humorless comedy or like losing the room and trying to get it back. And probably my upbringing has something to do with that too, of like proving to myself you can get some kind of connection back after you lose it, maybe. Couch
Great.
thoughts.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
I'm done.